Well, the team didn't resist. If they did, I didn't know anything about it. I think the press fought it in a sense. I think that's the first time I ever remember that a coach or a manager has been appointed and there was questions about his qualifications. You know, is he qualified? That's the first time. Now, there have been many managers in baseball. They change them about, or even in the National Basketball Association, the average coach lasts about 2.5 years. And so a lot of them must have some problems. Well, this is the first time I've heard as much discussion about qualifications.
When you talk about Bill Russell, you're talking about dominance redefined. There are legends in basketball, and then there's Bill Russell, 11-time NBA champion, 5-time MVP, 12-time All-Star, 2-time NCAA champion, Olympic gold medalist, and the man who turned defense from something you played into something you weaponized. From 1956 to 1969, Bill Russell didn't just dominate the game, he owned it. His 11 championships in 13 seasons remains the most decorated run in sports history. Not just basketball, sport, period. But here's what made Russell terrifying. He wasn't built like Wilt. He didn't shoot like West. He didn't care. While others chased points and glory, Russell chased one thing: wins. And he caught more than anyone who ever stepped on a court. Picture this: Boston Garden, 1965. The crowd is deafening. Wilt Chamberlain is barreling toward the rim with murderous intent. And there's Russell, 6 feet 10 inches, all arms and fury, rising to meet him, not just to block the shot, but to send a message. This is my house. These are my rules. That was Russell, a revolutionary who turned basketball into chess and himself into the ultimate grandmaster. But that legendary poise, that dignified leadership, don't be fooled. Beneath the calm exterior was something volcanic. Bill Russell played with controlled rage, with a memory that filed away every cheap shot, every disrespectful word, every line that shouldn't be crossed. He held grudges like trophies, and he never forgot. Some players earned his respect through competition and character. Others earned his eternal contempt. Because for all his brilliance and class, Russell was brutally honest about the players who disgusted him. Some made it personal, others tested his principles. A few crossed moral lines that Russell never forgave. And when the greatest winner in basketball history admits he hated someone, when a man who preached team unity and respect draws that line in the sand, you know they deserved every bit of it. This isn't about rivalry or competition. This is about the players who violated Russell's code, the 5 names that could still make his jaw tighten decades later. The men who didn't just lose his respect, they earned his disgust. Let's break down the 5 players Bill Russell genuinely hated. But before proceeding, please take a second and subscribe. And like this video, it will be very motivation for us. Bob Pettit gave Bill Russell more than a challenge. He gave him welts, rebounds snatched from his hands, and a legacy-shaping rivalry that began from Russell's very first season in the NBA. By the time Russell entered the league in 1956, Pettit was already a towering figure. The 6' 9" power forward had been named the league's first official MVP just a year earlier, and he wasn't interested in making room for the next big thing. Pettit was strong, strategic, and relentlessly physical. He averaged over 25 points and 16 rebounds that season, and never once dipped below 20 points per game in his entire 11-year career. That consistency, combined with his rebounding dominance and punishing style in the paint, made him a nightmare for any center, even Bill Russell. Their most famous clash came in the 1958 Finals, Celtics versus Hawks. Russell had just led Boston to a 49-23 record, dominating with defense and rebounding, and was deep into what would become a dynastic run of titles. But in Game 3, disaster struck. Russell severely sprained his ankle and was forced to miss the rest of the game and then return under limited mobility. The Hawks seized the opportunity. In Game 6, Bob Pettit put on a performance that became part of finals lore. He scored 50 points, a record at the time, and helped close out the Celtics 110-109. It remains one of the greatest closeout performances in NBA history. Pettit scored 18 of his team's final 21 points and outdueled every defender thrown at him. The Hawks won their first and only championship. Russell, limited by injury, watched that loss unfold from the bench. According to contemporary accounts, he appeared visibly frustrated and emotionally distant during the final minutes. Teammates would later describe the loss as one of the few that truly lingered with him, not just because of the title, but because he couldn't stop Pettit himself. In the years that followed, Russell and Pettit continued to clash, both physically and philosophically. Pettit was known for his bruising interior play, often initiating contact with elbows and hips to establish post position. Russell, though not one to shy away from physicality, often spoke about the importance of restraint in basketball as a mental discipline. While he rarely singled Pettit out by name in interviews, basketball historians and biographers have suggested that Russell considered Pettit one of his least liked opponents, not because of any personal betrayal, but because of the way Pettit played the game. In his 1979 memoir, Second Wind, Russell wrote about opponents who confused physicality with purpose, and while he didn't point the finger directly, several historians believe it was a thinly veiled reference to Pettit. Even in interviews late in life, when discussing rivals he respected, names like Elgin Baylor, Jerry West, and Oscar Robertson came up frequently. Pettit was rarely mentioned. There was mutual respect, no doubt. Pettit once said Russell was the greatest defensive player to ever live, and Russell acknowledged Pettit's scoring and rebounding in historical retrospectives. But respect didn't mean admiration. Theirs was not a warm rivalry. It was tense, bruising, and born from two players who never compromised on how they believed the game should be played. For Russell, Pettit embodied a style he found reckless, even if it was effective. And while he never used the word hate publicly in connection with Pettit, those who knew Russell understood the grudge wasn't easily forgotten. That 1958 finals loss, he never talked about it much, but the one time he did, he simply said, "It wasn't just about losing. It was who we lost to." And that said enough. No rivalry in basketball history carried more weight, literally and symbolically, than the one between Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain. They were the twin towers of an entire generation, their careers intertwined from the moment Wilt entered the league in 1959 until Russell's retirement in 1969. During that decade, their teams clashed in the regular season and postseason a combined over 140 times, with every matchup framed as a battle between individual brilliance and collective dominance. Chamberlain was a phenomenon. In his rookie season with the Philadelphia Warriors, he averaged 37.6 points and 27 rebounds per game, numbers that remain among the most staggering in NBA history. At 7 feet 1 inch and over 270 pounds, he was bigger, stronger, and statistically more explosive than anyone Russell had ever seen. But Russell didn't see basketball through the lens of stats. He saw it through wins. That contrast shaped their rivalry and their reputations. Russell's Celtics were built on defense, sacrifice, and systems that revolved around winning. Wilt's teams, though often talented, were known for relying heavily on his singular talents. The result was a lopsided record. Russell's teams went 57-37 against Wilt's in the regular season, and more crucially, 29-20 in the playoffs. And that's where the tension quietly simmered. Russell respected Chamberlain's dominance, but their philosophical differences ran deep. According to various biographies and interviews, Russell often felt that Wilt was more focused on individual performance than team outcome. He once commented that statistics never won games, a sentiment that, while not directly aimed at Chamberlain, often followed their conversations in the media. Their most famous playoff meeting came in the 1962 Eastern Conference Finals. In Game 7, Chamberlain recorded 22 points and 21 rebounds, but Russell had 19 points, 22 boards, and, as was often the case, the win. The Celtics advanced again. That moment became symbolic of their rivalry. Wilt filled the box score. Russell filled the trophy case. Off the court, their relationship was layered. In the early years, they shared meals and spoke warmly of each other in interviews. Russell even stayed at Wilt's house before one of their games, something unthinkable by modern rivalry standards. But by the late 1960s, their dynamic had cooled. Public comments turned passive-aggressive. Wilt would later claim in his autobiography that Russell had been supportive in person, but critical behind closed doors. He felt betrayed. One flashpoint was the 1969 NBA Finals, the last time they met on the court. In Game 7, Chamberlain left the game with a knee injury. Lakers coach Butch Van Breda-Kolff chose not to reinsert him late in the fourth quarter, and Russell's Celtics held on to win. After the game, reporters asked Russell about Wilt's injury. Some accounts suggest he was dismissive, others say he simply chose not to engage. Either way, the moment added strain to a relationship that had already frayed. Over the years, both men would revisit the rivalry in books and interviews. Russell once called Chamberlain the toughest opponent I ever faced. Chamberlain, for his part, often cited Russell as a worthy adversary, but couldn't resist noting that he had better individual stats in nearly every category. Still, when looking at the big picture, it's clear that what made their rivalry so compelling wasn't hatred in the traditional sense. It was philosophical, about what greatness really meant. Russell believed in doing what it took to win, even if it meant fewer points or personal acclaim. Chamberlain believed in pushing the boundaries of what one man could do on a basketball court. Those values didn't always align, and it's no surprise they sometimes clashed, publicly and privately. In one interview years later, Russell said something that, without naming Wilt, still echoed their entire relationship. The most important measure of how good a game I played was how much better I'd made my teammates play. It was a quiet statement, but in the context of a rivalry with the most statistically dominant player of all time, it said everything Russell needed to. They were basketball's yin and yang, two titans bound by the game, separated by philosophy, and remembered forever as the greatest measuring stick each other ever had. In his very first season in the NBA, Bill Russell made it clear he wasn't just there to play, he was there to dominate, and more importantly, to command respect. But there was one man who tested him early: Ray Felix. Felix wasn't just another big body in the paint. He had credentials. In 1954, he became the first black player to win NBA Rookie of the Year, putting up double-doubles before Russell even entered the league. Standing 6'11" with a long frame and a quiet confidence, Felix had spent years playing tough, physical basketball for the Baltimore Bullets, New York Knicks, and eventually the Lakers. He wasn't a star, but he wasn't soft either. And in the rougher, less regulated era of the 1950s, veteran players often made a point of testing rookies, especially those threatening to change the landscape. Early in the 1956-57 season, in a game between the Celtics and the Knicks, tensions escalated. The stories differ slightly depending on the source, but one fact stands undisputed: Bill Russell punched Ray Felix right there on the court. According to newspaper accounts and Russell's own recollections, he felt provoked. Some reports suggest Felix had been playing overly physical, perhaps trying to intimidate the rookie. There's no video footage, and the box score doesn't reflect technical fouls or ejections, just the whispered legend passed down across decades. Russell wasn't thrown out of the game. He wasn't suspended, but he was fined $25, a modest amount by today's standards, but a firm message from the league in that era. And just like that, the NBA had its first real glimpse of the fire burning beneath Russell's calm exterior. In his later years, Russell never shied away from retelling the story, though he rarely mentioned Felix by name. In interviews and books like Second Wind, he spoke about being tested, about the physicality of the league, and about how essential it was to set boundaries early. "I never started anything," he once said, "but I wasn't going to take anything either." He didn't romanticize it. He didn't glorify the punch, but he was honest. The NBA was a man's league, and if you didn't stand your ground, someone would try to knock you off it. For Ray Felix, that moment became a permanent footnote in his career. He continued to play respectably for several seasons, but when his name surfaced in later years, it often came tethered to that early altercation. Whether that's fair or not is up for debate, but in Russell's mind, it wasn't personal. It was about tone, message, command. Russell didn't hate Ray Felix for being physical, but he hated what the moment represented: a veteran trying to put a target on a young player's back. For Russell, whose career was built on discipline, team success, and personal dignity, that crossed the line. The punch didn't define him, but it did define how he'd be treated from that day forward. No one ever tried that again. By the mid-1960s, Jerry West had become the face of the Los Angeles Lakers, a wiry sharpshooter with ice in his veins and a reputation for clutch performances. But to Bill Russell, West wasn't just a rival. He was the personification of a franchise that just couldn't break Boston's hold on the league. And despite the public praise, Russell never seemed fully comfortable with how West was portrayed. Between 1959 and 1969, the Celtics and Lakers met 6 times in the NBA Finals. Boston won every single series. West was heroic in defeat more than once, dropping 40 points in Game 1 of the 65 Finals, scoring 53 in Game 1 of the 65 Finals, 69 Finals, and even winning Finals MVP in 1969 despite losing the series, the only time that's ever happened. But for Russell, those accolades seemed to miss the point. Russell's game was built around defense, rebounding, sacrifice, doing the invisible things that win titles. He couldn't understand the glorification of individual brilliance that didn't lead to rings. In Game 7 of the 1962 Finals, West managed just 4 of 13 shooting, while Russell grabbed a jaw-dropping 40 rebounds in an overtime win that sealed another banner for Boston. That contrast, quiet dominance versus flashy heartbreak, played out again and again. Though the two respected each other publicly, there was a tension underneath. Russell's Celtics were often framed by the press as cold or mechanical, while West's Lakers, though winless in their rivalry, were described as noble, emotional, even tragic. Russell didn't appreciate the narrative that seemed to celebrate close calls more than actual championships. In later interviews, Russell often emphasized that winning wasn't just about talent, it was about values, about doing what it took. And while he never attacked West personally, he made it clear that he didn't see moral victories as victories at all. Still, in 1969, in Russell's final game as both player and coach, West nearly broke through. He scored 42 points in Game 7, nearly willing the Lakers to victory, but Russell's Celtics held on, winning by just 2 points, 108-106, and closing the curtain on the most dominant era in NBA history. West got the Finals MVP. Russell got his 11th championship ring. Some say Russell later made peace with the idea that greatness came in different forms. Others believe he always carried a quiet resentment toward the idea that effort was being equated with legacy. Whatever the case, he beat West every time it mattered most, and when it was over, he walked away. No farewell tour, no press conference, just another championship, another mission completed. For Russell, that was the only story worth telling. By the early 1960s, Elgin Baylor had become a force of nature, a scoring savant who defied the era's gravity and traditional form. At a time when most players kept their feet on the floor and moved in straight lines, Baylor attacked the rim with contortionist grace and hang time that seemed to break the rules. Over his 14-year career, he averaged 27.4 points and 13.5 rebounds per game, rewriting the expectations of what a forward could do. But to Bill Russell, none of it ever seemed to matter when it counted most. Between 1958 and 1969, Baylor and Russell met in the postseason over and over again. Their teams collided in the NBA Finals 7 times, and in every one of those series, the Boston Celtics walked away champions, while Baylor's Lakers were left picking up the pieces. Over the course of their matchups, Baylor went 31-56 against Russell in head-to-head games, and despite all the flair, the accolades, and the highlight reels, Baylor never won a single championship while actively playing. His career would become one of the most tragic what-ifs in NBA history. The most unforgettable moment in their rivalry came in the 1962 NBA Finals, Game 5. With the series tied 2-2, Baylor erupted for 61 points and 22 rebounds, a performance so explosive that it still stands as the NBA Finals single-game scoring record to this day. The Celtics had no answer, but instead of letting that moment define the series, Russell answered back. In Game 7, with everything on the line, he pulled down an outrageous 40 rebounds, and the Celtics won the title in overtime. It was Baylor's most brilliant finals performance, and yet again, it ended in heartbreak. There was no public feud between the two, no on-court fight, no microphone-grabbing rant, no dramatic headline, but some sports writers and historians sensed a tension that lingered beneath the surface. Not personal, but philosophical. Baylor was a showman, dazzling and improvisational. Russell was a tactician, obsessed with execution and team dynamics. To Russell, who built his legacy on defense, discipline, and winning. Above all, Baylor's more individualistic style may have felt like flash without substance. It's worth noting that Baylor's career was also weighed down by cruel timing. In 1971, just 9 games into the season, his knees gave out for good. He retired in October. Days later, the Lakers began a 33-game win streak, the longest in NBA history, and they went on to win the 1972 championship. For years, fans debated whether Baylor should be considered part of that title run. Officially, he received a ring, but emotionally, he wasn't on the floor for the crowning moment he'd spent his whole career chasing. Russell had retired 2 years earlier, going out not just as a player, but as a player-coach with 11 championships in 13 seasons. He had nothing left to prove. If Russell ever expressed open frustration with Baylor, it's not on record. But based on his public philosophy, his disdain for empty stats, and his absolute prioritization of winning, it's hard not to imagine him seeing Baylor as the perfect contrast. The Lakers had talent, but not the edge, not the system, not the sacrifice. And when it came to the Celtics dynasty, that difference always showed up when it mattered most. In the end, Elgin Baylor retired with numbers that inspired awe and a resume that inspired sorrow. And for Bill Russell, who viewed basketball as a vehicle for values like unity, sacrifice, and legacy, Baylor may have represented everything beautiful about the game that still somehow fell short, not because of lack of effort, but because brilliance alone was never enough to crack Russell's code. Here we concluded this list. If you want to know the 5 players Kareem hated the most, click the video appear on your screen, and trust me, the names might surprise you. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and drop a comment.